All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're exploring how an airline that literally symbolized the absolute golden age of American aviation was almost entirely erased from history. Imagine a company that carried millions of passengers, employed over 40,000 people at its peak, and basically defined an entire era of travel only to just vanish into thin air. Today, when we think of classic aviation, names like Pan Am or TWA usually pop up. But there was another absolute titan dominating the skies. We're going to unpack the incredible rise, the staggering success, and the ultimate spectacular collapse of Eastern Airlines.
To really wrap our heads around this corporate tragedy, we have to ask ourselves a pretty crazy question. How does a company that absolutely dominated the skies, pulling in billions in revenue, completely disappear? We aren't just talking about some minor regional carrier quietly going out of business here. We're talking about a massive, seemingly invincible corporate giant. How do you go from being the airline for millions of Americans to having literally no planes, no logo, and zero presence? Let's figure that out by taking a look at where they started.
Section 1. The Golden Age of Flight. Back when airlines sold luxury.
Think about it. In the 1950s through the 70s, flying was a whole event. Passengers actually dressed up in their absolute best clothes. Yet huge, comfortable seats and flight attendants were serving meals on actual real plates. They treated passengers like royalty, turning the cabin into this flying hotel where celebrities, business executives, and everyday tourists were all mingling. Contrast that with what we deal with today, right? Tiny seats, endless security lines, and those dreaded extra baggage fees. In that golden era, airlines didn't compete on cheap ticket prices. They fought over who could provide the most luxurious, comfortable experience. In Eastern, they were absolute masters of this game. But Eastern didn't actually start out as a luxury brand. Way back in the 1920s, they were just a scrappy small mail carrier. But they rapidly pivoted and expanded into passenger flights. Soon enough, their routes were stretching all the way up and down the eastern United States, and eventually they pushed outward into the Caribbean and Latin America. For decades, if you lived on the East Coast and needed to fly somewhere, you didn't just book a flight, you booked an Eastern flight. They were completely, fundamentally woven into the fabric of American travel.
Moving to Section 2, Building an Aviation Giant, the Eddie Rickenbacker Era.
To understand Eastern, you really have to look at the guy running the show, Eddie Rickenbacker. He was America's top fighter ace from World War I, a bona fide war hero, and a national celebrity long before he took the helm at Eastern. And his leadership style, it was defined by these deep, unyielding pillars. He was absolutely obsessed with extreme operational discipline, bringing literal military-grade rigor to commercial flight. He demanded unmatched reliability and uncompromising safety from every single employee, whether you were a mechanic turning wrenches or the pilot in the cockpit. And this wasn't just corporate speak. This discipline forged a culture of excellence that turned Eastern into an absolute powerhouse. Because of that extreme discipline, Eastern joined the ranks of the Big Four in America, sitting right up there alongside names we obviously still know today, like United and American Airlines. They commanded the busiest hubs in the entire country: Miami, New York City, Atlanta. These were, and honestly still are, some of the most critical high-traffic aviation arteries in the world, and Eastern just completely dominated them. With Rickenbacker's discipline and this massive network, they seemed entirely bulletproof. But as we all know, the higher you fly, the harder you can fall. Which brings us to Section 3, Jets, Debt, and Deregulation. Basically, when the rules of the game completely change.
So the jet age was a huge turning point. Eastern went all in, investing heavily in incredible new aircraft like the legendary Boeing 727 and the Douglas DC-9. These planes were faster, they flew longer routes, and they held way more passengers. It seemed like a total win, right? Well, beneath the surface, some truly devastating costs were brewing. These modern jets were incredibly expensive to buy, and around the same time, global fuel costs started to spike. Plus, the maintenance required to keep these complex machines flying safely, that just absolutely exploded. All of this underlying financial pressure started stirring up some really serious labor disputes behind the scenes.
And then came 1978, the year the government essentially stopped holding the airlines' hands. This is the big catalyst for the modern aviation landscape we know today. Before '78, the U.S. government controlled the routes and practically dictated the pricing. But with deregulation, the training wheels came off. Suddenly, airlines were thrown into a free market cage match. They no longer had guaranteed margins. They had to compete aggressively with each other, fighting tooth and nail for every single passenger.
So competition intensified, and ticket prices dropped dramatically.
Profit margins, which were already getting squeezed by the cost of those expensive jets, became razor thin. Now, some airlines figured out how to adapt to this cutthroat new environment. But Eastern, they were completely trapped under a mountain of debt. Their operating costs were just sky high, and those hostile battles between management and the labor unions were getting worse by the day. The golden era was officially over.
Section 4. Strikes, Bankruptcy, and Collapse. The Final Descent.
Enter businessman Frank Lorenzo. When he stepped in to try and save the financially bleeding airline, the proud, reliable culture that Eddie Rickenbacker had built was immediately replaced by aggressive, genuinely terrifying cost-cutting. Lorenzo had a really fierce reputation, and he notoriously used bankruptcy maneuvers specifically to break established union contracts. So the employees were terrified. They felt he was dismantling the very soul of the airline. The pride was entirely gone, replaced by deep fear and bitter, bitter conflict.
Eventually, all those boardroom tensions exploded right onto the tarmac. The pilots, the literal people needed to fly the planes, walked out on strike. The mechanics launched protests. The result? Widespread flight cancellations. I mean, imagine being a loyal Eastern passenger. You arrive at the airport and find out your flight is canceled because of a massive labor war. Passenger confidence completely evaporated. And in the airline business, trust is your ultimate currency. Once you lose the public's trust, bouncing back becomes almost impossible.
The descent was incredibly rapid. Just tracking the timeline, following the initial shock of deregulation in '78, you fast forward to the late 1980s, and the airline is just bleeding cash. They were forced into this desperate survival mode, literally selling off their own aircraft, slashing their historic routes, and laying off thousands of employees just to try and keep the lights on. But it wasn't enough. In 1989, Eastern officially filed for bankruptcy. They tried to limp along for a bit, but the damage was terminal. On January 19, 1991, Eastern Airlines shut its doors forever. Thousands of jobs vanished, passengers were left stranded, and an aviation titan simply ceased to exist.
And finally, Section 5, the legacy left behind. Erased from the skies, but absorbed into history. Here's a pretty wild thought. If you fly today, you are more than likely flying in Eastern's old footprint. They might be a ghost, but their DNA is absolutely everywhere in modern aviation. Those massive routes they pioneered, they were immediately scooped up and are now operated by the airlines you fly on right now. The infrastructure they funded is still the foundation for the busiest airports in America. Plus, all those highly trained mechanics, flight attendants, and pilots carried Rickenbacker's original standards of excellence with them to other airlines. And of course, there's a dedicated community of fans and collectors who preserve the old uniforms and commercials, keeping the memory of that lost golden age alive.
So wrapping up this explainer, Eastern's story is this stark, unavoidable reminder of corporate mortality. We've just seen how an absolute titan of industry, a company that defined luxury, dominated major hubs, and employed tens of thousands of people, was completely brought down by a perfect storm of technological costs, regulatory shifts, and a total failure to maintain its internal culture. It proves, without a doubt, that past success guarantees absolutely nothing about future survival. Take a look around at the seemingly invincible companies dominating our world today. If the rules of the game change tomorrow, which of today's giants will be the next to vanish, becoming just another ghost story for future generations to study? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.